I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture.
The tour of the underwater city can be taken as a metaphor, exactly as the ideas of Andrew Ryan seemed fair, logical, and even perfect. Rapture also stroked with its magnificence as it's made its first appearance, looking like an impregnable fortress within which every dweller feels safe. But as many already know, behind Ryan's big words lurked a twisted system of values, and behind the facade of elite skyscrapers there was not a hint of security. Instead, there were death, fear, and dread. We present to you the much anticipated video about the iconic series of Bioshock. In today's video, you'll learn how the idea for the game was born, how its story plays with the philosophy of objectivism, why Bioshock became so iconic, and how did the series die. You're on Dragmatic. Please like and subscribe, and remember, no gods or kings, only man. It's common knowledge that Bioshock was inspired by a game from Looking Glass Studio, System Shock. The second part was developed by the team from Irrational Games led by Ken Levine, who managed to scoop some inspiration in the process of development, and even after the commercial flop of the sequel, they made plans for something of their own. Initially, there was only one idea: to make their own System Shock with Andrew Ryan and the sisters. There was no setting and even a draft of the story whatsoever, so the first builds hardly resembled the Bioshock we know. In the early prototypes, according to the developers, the action took place underwater, but not in the Art Deco styled alleys of Rapture, but in something that resembles a spaceship from Star Trek. The RPG system has also undergone numerous changes. Inspired by System Shock, Bioshock received way too many RPG elements. There was no way you could have lockpicked a door if you didn't have the corresponding perk. You wouldn't have beaten a location if you didn't pick up some item somewhere way back a long time ago. The design came out extremely bulky, and the team realized that players would have to put much too effort in order to get basic fun. In other words, the first version of the game was so bad that it would never have been allowed to be realized. Later, most of the drafts had to be changed. Designers, artists, and developers began to actually work as a team to get a more integral product. The game itself was written on the modified Unreal Engine 3. A huge role in the game, about an underwater city, is played by, surprise surprise, water. To work out the realistic physics of water and its reflection, special programmers and artists were hired, who were responsible solely for this aspect. The overloaded RPG components was simplified in favor of a more accessible but no less fascinating gameplay. In the end, almost all the decisions that Ken Levine and his team took were aimed at making Bioshock intuitive for the mass player. The game had to challenge gamers in a certain way, while remaining somewhat complex without overdoing it. Finally, having found the right vector of development for the project, the development went on much more briskly. Thus, Bioshock got its foundation, in the form of the underwater city of Rapture, which we are all familiar with. But this raised the question, who on earth would even think of building such a city, and why? So Ken Levine and his team came up with Andrew Ryan, an entrepreneur born in the Russian Empire, but came to the United States after the Bolshevik takeover. He was a fierce anti-communist and lived by the motto, "Everything I had earned by honest work belongs to me, and to me alone." But even the capitalist America wasn't enough for Ryan. At first, of course, he made a huge fortune from selling steel and became a tycoon. But then happened the crisis of the 40s, which hit his company pretty hard. Then, the Great Depression, and finally, the threat of nuclear war. The latter finally made the businessman lose all faith in all kinds of institutions and cemented his beliefs about objectivism. And what do men of fortune usually build at the first threat of a nuclear strike? That's right, a fallout shelter. Rapture is actually one huge fallout shelter. Only unlike Vault Tech, Ryan Industries has come up with a slightly crazier and more elegant approach when building it. There are similarities, of course. Both had human experiments conducted within its walls, and both were primarily built for people useful to the society: scientists, doctors, construction workers, and others. In any case, at the first threat of war, Ryan decided to play it safe. He needed to build a shelter that could protect not just from the falling bombs, but also from the long-reaching arms of the authorities, no matter what state. In his search for the perfect spot, fate led him to the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. And having laid a solid foundation, Ryan started to build a dream city whose buildings were constructed with a special aluminum alloy. The first to be built was Hephaestus, a geothermal power plant that provided energy for the entire city. Then came the self-sufficient ecosystem called Arcadia, which produces oxygen for the city's inhabitants, and the Tinker's machine, responsible for all the automatic systems and other structures. In total, the construction of the city took about 6 years, and at first, Rapture really was heaven on earth. It flourished, gathering all the cream of society: artists, scientists, philosophers, creators. The only rule was no contact with the outside world. Rapture was an exceptionally secret place for the elite and outside the jurisdiction of any country, as it was located on a neutral territory. And everything would have gone on just swell, but at one point sea slugs with a unique substance inside them called Adam were discovered. This substance not only restores damaged tissues of the body, but also possesses mutagenic properties. So in the course of experiments financed by Frank Fontaine, a businessman who made his fortune from smuggling, scientists Brigitte Tenenbaum and Yi Sushong created special serums based on Adam called the plasmids. They allowed to shoot lightnings and fireballs, move objects with the power of mind, and do many other things that a normal person would never be able to. Naturally, such a thing became an instant hit, and every resident of Rapture wanted to get his hands on a plasmid. However, plasmids had a side effect: they quickly caused an addiction. After using it, the body required a constantly increasing dosage. The business of selling the modifiers was booming, but there wasn't enough slugs to meet the huge demand for the new drug. The decision was made to use living donors targeting orphans, young girls who had the slugs implanted in their stomachs. This caused the girls to turn into so-called angels or little sisters, generating Adam in large quantities. This prompted the Adam-dependent population, already resembling mutants more than people, to attack the sisters and suck the substance out of them. To protect the angels, Big Daddies were developed, super soldiers who would protect their girls to the bitter end. Feel how the image of paradise is starting to crack? Well, this is only the beginning. In the midst of class inequality and constant civil unrest, Fontaine led the underclass and launched a civil war for power over the city. Ryan managed to brutally suppress the rebellion, privatize Fontaine Futuristics, and organize a secret police force that either imprisoned all dissenters or turned them into Big Daddies. By these actions, Andrew betrayed his own principles of individualism, fair market, and free speech, and Rapture went from being Ryan Industries' greatest achievement to its greatest failure. Fontaine seems to be defeated. Ryan has become a full-fledged dictator. The city streets that were once polished to a shine and teeming with laughter now look like a ghetto, and all they are teeming with now is the heavy breathing of Big Daddies. And here, flying over the Atlantic Ocean, then experiencing a plane crash and emerging next to a lighthouse, the protagonist comes on stage. From the very first minutes of gameplay, Bioshock sets the tone for everything that happens next. Majestic golden statues, bright neon signs, monumental high-rises as if ripped from the grounds of Manhattan, all of them will only remind of the city's lost grace and act as decorations for the dark, bloody, and insane adventures of the main character. The shooter component here is diluted by the plasmid system. Alternating these two will not get boring until the end of the very game, because both offer a good arsenal which can also be modified. For the developers, simply creating these tools wasn't enough. They had to make them actually work in the hands of the gamers. And here, Irrational Games sure didn't screw up. The developers aptly scattered all sorts of obstacles, no matter in the form of living creatures like mutants or inanimate objects, such as turrets, created situations in which the player had to use superpowers. For example, when the enemies were almost knee-deep in water, it was a sin not to launch a lightning bolt at them. And when you see a gang of splicers near a Big Daddy, your hand just reaches for the hypnosis plasmid. One click and the formidable killing machine becomes your ally. Sometimes you can create peculiar situations yourself. I'm sure I'm not the only one who pitted these big guys against each other, and either killed the winner myself or hypnotized him. All of this, again, is thanks to the cunning level design. It allows the plasmid system to offer its full potential, while the player decides whether to use this potential or not. Bioshock won't let you get bored, even if you want to. You never know which mutant is waiting for you around the corner, and the combat tactics will change, depending on which mutant you meet. A regular goon can be dealt with in close combat with a wrench. With all the rest, it's preferable to keep distance, using either guns or superpowers. Nitro mutants like to throw grenades and explode when they die, cosplaying Mujahideen. Spiders obviously can climb walls and ceilings, while mages have fun throwing fireballs at you. Of course, you can shoot them, freeze them, or set them on fire, or you can set a patrol on them and finish off those who remain. Better yet, hypnotize a Big Daddy, or Bubbles as he's often called, and enjoy the brutal beating of the mutants. But don't think that the game will allow you to pour rains of bullets on your enemies like Rambo and trash them around effortlessly. Ammo will always be in short supply. The higher the firepower of the gun you have in your hand, the less chance you have of finding an extra bullet for it. It won't be too hard to find good plasmids, but you'll need Eve to use them, which is a modified atom. Eve plays the role of mana and is spent each time you use a plasmid. Mutants hit pretty hard, constantly alternating, and there are cameras everywhere, altering the security system about your presence. Once you've been spotted, be ready to shoot back at pesky flying drones. Of course, you can hack the damn camera and then all the security machines will be targeting the mutants. Or, if you have purchased the security bullseye plasmid, throw it at your enemy and without any hacking for a certain period of time, the robots will be shooting at your enemies. Traps with turrets will also be quite a nuisance for the protagonist. The kill and make you start again from the nearest barricade type of nuisance. Destroy the turret and move on, or hack it and use it against your enemies. That's the beauty of the game. It doesn't force you to go along a specific preset way of problem solving. Instead, it gives you the freedom of choice and the necessary tools. The former plays quite an important role. For example, saving the sisters at a loss is a reminiscent of the moral choice in Dishonored, where you have to pay for the fun, albeit not right away, but at the end. The same goes for Bioshock. It may not seem quite obvious to the player at first that his choice will determine the end of the game. It's if the artists purposely made little sisters so eerily repulsive with glowing eyes and pale skin that feels like it's decomposing. They will be hostile to the player by default because any creature other than Big Daddy is perceived to them as a threat. Just think about it. You encounter Mr. Bubbles and next to him walks a creepy girl who commands him to impale you on his drill. Naturally, you'll have to kill this mooning abomination, which is not that easy. Usually, this is a very resource-consuming task. And after such a deadly fight, which happened because of the girl, the game gives you a choice to suck all the Adam out of her, killing her, or to heal her, but get a big nothing sandwich in return. You only have to make a mistake once, sucking all the Adam out of an angel, and you've already screwed up the ending. In the second part, it's a bit easier. The sequel will offer the player to take on the role of a Big Daddy, so if you don't pull the slug out of the girl's body, she will help you by sucking Adam from nearby corpses. And since we're talking about Bioshock 2, it's worth noting that the sequel was developed by another studio called 2K Marin with the support of the renowned Arcane Studios. But how come? When the release of the original game was marked by excellent sales, dizzying success, and almost instant iconic status. Ken Levine has repeatedly admitted that working in a major studio on an AAA project is a terribly tedious thing for him, making him a miserable man. That's why he decided to give his team a break to start working on Part 3 with a bright mind, while the sequel was entrusted to the American colleagues. And judging by scores, as well as personal impressions about the game, 2K Marin actually did quite well, although they didn't make a revolution. The game already felt repetitive in places, the gameplay received little to no changes, except that now you could use firearms and plasmids at the same time. And what about the drill? That's right, the second Bioshock offers the player to take on the role of a Big Daddy, and thus explore locations that were previously difficult to access. Thus, for example, several times the protagonist was allowed to wander around underwater locations outside the city or within the city, but where there's already nothing left of it. Mr. Bubbles' suit will protect the main character from drowning. In my opinion, such episodes do a great job for the immersion effect, and you get completely used to your new role. The gameplay has mostly benefited from this and has become a bit more fun, but for the most part, you shouldn't expect any other innovations. It really is disappointing, because from the great original, you expect a great sequel, but to call this the second part would be a great overestimation. Even the story took a tumble, which presents us with the game's antagonist, a psychologist and a communist, whom we hear nothing about in the first game. I think it goes without saying that she doesn't possess any charisma whatsoever. She's just another empty and hackneyed villain. The secondary characters also won't please you with their originality. There are no expressive and bright personalities like Cohen.
Do you see it? When I am dust, this is what they'll point to. My quad tick. My masterpiece. Go ahead. Don't be afraid.
2K Marin tried to integrate multiplayer into Bioshock, but failed to implement and support it properly. Modes were banal as hell, like get the little sister from point A to point B while protecting her from hordes of enemies. And to get to the online, you could only count on God's help while trying to solve problems with connections, lags, and player search. In short, the main complaint against the sequel is the unreached bar of quality that the original seemingly placed way too high. But if we imagine that the first part never existed, then yes, Bioshock 2 is a masterpiece.
Look, Daddy, it's you.
But we live in a universe where the first part does exist, so let's get back to it one more time and try to understand why it became so iconic. I believe that the game got such a status for its versatility and ability to comment on such interesting yet complex topics, using the language of video games. At a certain point, I caught myself thinking that deconstructing Bioshock, analyzing its plot, and even just reading about the game is even more interesting to me than actually playing it. But again, there's nothing wrong with its gameplay. And I'm even kind of happy that I got to try the creation of irrational games not as a child, but at a mature age. Because let's face it, if you were 7 years old, you would hardly think about the philosophical subtext hidden under the guise of a first-person shooter. And although the story is in fact as old as the sea, and today it will hardly surprise even an average gamer, the game got its iconic status right after release precisely because no other video game had ever evoked such complex topics in such a graceful and dark way before. Humanism, objectivism, open market, freedom of speech, and the absence of censorship and morality in our usual sense. It is the absence of almost all of the above that caused Rapture's downfall. The game does not tell us about this, but shows and lets us see for ourselves. Bioshock envelops the player with a feeling of loneliness and gloom, only occasionally introducing him to minor characters. But usually only to add to the feeling of loneliness and to show how the ideas of Andrew Ryan have disfigured the once swell society. Take Sander Cohen, for example. The missions that involved him were the most memorable to me. In Ryan's ideology, neither censorship nor morality was supposed to be an impediment to the artist, so even when Cohen's work was harmful to citizens, Andrew turned a blind eye to it. As a result, we have a manic homosexual artist who kills his students by blowing him up with dynamite over a poor piano performance.
No!
Oh God, you sick fuck, let me out of there!
For some reason, the Sander Cohen reference reminded me about the case of the Serbian artist Marina Abramovic. During her performance, she stood motionless for 6 hours while people who came to look at her could do anything they wanted with her, using 72 items in her disposal, from harmless flowers to a loaded gun. While at first the visitors were nice and would give her roses and gently touch her, by the end of the situation changed drastically as they started taunting her, taking off all her clothes, cutting her skin and hair, groping and sexually assaulting the artist. The same thing happened to the inhabitants of Rapture with its unregulated society. It doesn't matter who is in front of you, a worker or a man of supposedly swell society. Both having overwhelming freedom, absence of any censorship, and the basic morality and ethics will turn into a parody of themselves. In other words, splicers, ugly mutants. But let's get back to Andrew Ryan. Did we really beat him? This is where the fateful phrase, "would you kindly," comes in. It marked the protagonist's helplessness, not so much before Ryan as before the main villain, Fontaine, who is hiding under the guise of Atlas. The protagonist was only a programmed puppet all along, obeying orders as soon as he heard the trigger phrase, "would you kindly." The silent protagonist turned out to be just a tool. Ryan kept trying to prove it to us, and in the end he finally did it at the cost of his own life. His death, to me, is one of the most original, unusual, and confusing.
Kill!
Andrew Ryan's death doesn't prove his defeat at all, but it does prove the defeat of the protagonist at this particular part of the path. A man chooses, a slave obeys. With these words, the tycoon doesn't save his own skin, but commits suicide by the hands of the main character. Ryan lost not at the moment of his demise, but long before it, when he violated his own principles and reduced Rapture to ruins with his actions. This actually echoes with the fate of another awesome sea-related villain, Davy Jones from Pirates of the Caribbean. In the scene where he is talking to the love of his life, Calypso, she tells him,
"You have corrupted your purpose, and so yourself."
The protagonist's end is as simplistic as it is wonderful, I shall say. The player will get exactly what he deserves, depending on the decisions he makes. The endings can differ quite a lot and leave either a bitter taste of dread and defeat or a feeling that everything was not for naught. No gods or kings, only man. Forget it, tells us Bioshock Infinite, defiantly turning everything upside down in the entire franchise. Forget Andrew Ryan and his Maximus. No more individualism. This time there will be gods and kings, with one character combining both titles. 2 for the price of 1. Forget the filthy and crushing basements of Rapture. Look up, see, there beyond the clouds. And we forgot as soon as we saw Columbia.
Hallelujah.
How can one love Bioshock without Big Daddies? Without the elegant yet blood-soaked halls of Rapture? Without the huge panoramic windows hiding the secrets of the silent Atlantic Ocean? Without little sisters, for crying out loud? The answer lies almost 5,000 meters above the ground in the flying city of Columbia. The game industry works in mysterious ways after all. Even remarkable sales and the unanimous appraisal both from players and critics cannot guarantee a bright future for the developers. Project Icarus is the clearest example of this. Let's go back to the moment of the first Bioshock's release, where it all began. After a long and tiring crunches, Irrational Games finally released their debut project, which blows up the whole market. Gamers are ecstatic, critics are amazed, and the developers are shocked. For them, such an exuberant and positive reaction seems to be sort of a prank. Almost 2.5 million copies are sold, 96 out of a possible 100 points on Metacritic. all seemed simply too good to be true. Nevertheless, the months spent in terrible crunches inevitably affected the mental health of the staff, so Ken's team was clearly not ready to start the development of the sequel right away. However, the director of 2K, with the words, "That doesn't seem like a me problem," requested the development of the second part almost instantly. Christoph Hartmann said roughly the following: "We want Bioshock to come out every year, make at least 6 sequels, take cues from other sci-fi franchises. Take Star Wars for example, a story about the fight between good and evil, just like in Bioshock." Considering that in Bioshock there was no fight between good and evil in the first place, the statement of the 2K CEO perfectly illustrates how far the fat cats in charge are from the process of creating not just a product, but a video game for generations to come. Long story short, the question was not will there be Bioshock 2, the question was who will develop it. So a compromise had to be achieved. Part of the Irrational Games team went to the office in San Francisco and formed the 2K Marin studio, which was tasked to start developing the second Bioshock. The rest of the team, led by Levine, was already able to develop other projects. After spending some time working on the new XCOM, the studio was sent to do what they do best, developing Bioshock, the third part of it to be precise. Just as with the original game, at the stage of pre-production, the studio had only one idea related to the setting. No one wanted to bring Rapture back. 3 games in a row, in the same location, would have been an obvious overkill. However, the concept of a city among the clouds appealed to everyone with no exceptions. As Ken Levine was strongly against numerous sequels and often argued with the executives about it, he decided to call the third part Infinite. This way, he would spare his brainchild from becoming a cash cow, as there will be no Infinite 2. Having decided on the place of action, the devs still had to decide on a shit ton of detail. Era, art style, architecture, the story for Christ's sake. As time went on, the game remained in a purgatory of constant changes. Levine was rejecting idea after idea, and it could be huge chunks of work. The development was literally going by trial and error, even after the debut teaser in 2010. The game still continued to change. Along with the single-player campaign, the team was working on a multiplayer in the hope to increase the replayability of the project, but the development of the story campaign was so behind schedule that the idea of an online mode was abandoned altogether. Production processes were far from being organized, a lot of work was outsourced, and when finished, chunks of work were sent to the studio. They no longer needed it, because Levine already managed to change everything once again. Being a genius creator, but a terrible manager, Ken almost ruined his own brainchild. He simply could not communicate to his subordinates what exactly he wanted from them. So when Rod Ferguson from Epic Games, who knew how to finish games and communicate with people like Ken Levine, joined the studio, everyone sighed with relief. Rod came up with a schedule, broke the work down into separate tasks, and made the individual pieces of the game come together into an integral work of art in a very short period of time. So, what was the outcome? Infinite was the outcome, which in some places was very different from its prototype. In its very early build, you could see a much darker version of Columbia and a completely different Elizabeth. The artbook featured a different version of the Songbird, which bears a heavy resemblance to Mr. Bubbles. The mechanical Mothman looked very epic and cumbersome, but in the end, the developers chose the Songbird. Of the little things, the Skyhook also looked different. In the debut gameplay trailer, the monotrails were redesigned, and Elizabeth possessed some kind of magic rather than the ability to open portals. All in all, a lot of the gameplay was either heavily modified or went under the knife altogether. Did it make the game worse? In my humble opinion, no. In the opinion of millions of players, also no. 3.7 million copies sold in the first year, and universal love. So, what was the new part of Bioshock exactly? Let's start with the setting. Rapture was the main gem of Bioshock, both in the original and in the sequel. Infinite, on the other hand, offers us 2 gems at once. The first is the new city. It's rather symbolic that having reached the bottom during the development of the threequel, Irrational Games had only one way out, to push off the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and ascend to the celestial city of Columbia. At first, it looks like the exact opposite of Rapture. The cold, crushing underwater tunnels have been replaced by the warm and spacious alleyways of the Cloud City. This time, the city wasn't built by a tycoon inspired by the ideas of Ayn Rand. But by the US government in 1890, Columbia became a symbol of success, showing the superiority of American technological excellence over the rest of the world. But at some point, a man named Zachary Comstock seized power over the city, deciding that Columbia was already armed and self-sufficient enough, and therefore it was time to break free from the United States and spread democracy by themselves. However, instead of democracy, Comstock created a personality cult and implemented a religiously fanatical policy that promoted ultra-nationalism and racism. The ruling party decided to call themselves the Founders. A camp of protesting anarcho-communists called Vox Populi was formed, who did not like the state of affairs one bit. This resulted in a civil war. At first glance, it's hard to notice the wounds on that city's surface caused by all the infighting. The squares are clean and tidy, the alleys are safe, people are happily splashing on the beach, life is thriving everywhere you look. But once you get down to earth, which sounds a bit weird in the context of Columbia, and take a more thorough look in any location in the city, its blemishes pop out immediately. The police keep the citizens in an iron fist. It's a police state. All the dirty work is done exclusively by foreigners, Irish and African Americans. The white population is privileged, and Comstock is practically worshipped as a god. Anyway, Columbia as a work of architecture was simply majestic. Entire districts held up by huge balloons, drawbridges, connection streets, air transport with moving train cars. Ken Levine said that his main disappointment in developing the original was the ocean, which the player was never allowed to interact with. While developing Infinite, Levine's goal was to allow the player to use the environment properly. And what exactly is the environment surrounding Columbia? The air, the sky, the clouds. How do you interact with all that? Shove the hero into an airplane or a balloon? Actually, what about a roller coaster? Thus, aerial tracks for transporting cars were added to the game. You could cling to these monorails and go up and down, jumping from one line to another, shooting enemies while catching wind with your face. Sounds like vertical gameplay, which it is. The aerial advantage will save your life numerous times, allowing you to jump behind your enemy's back and put a bullet through their skull. But don't forget that the enemy can also chase you both on land and in the air. The bots themselves have become more diverse. Mutants were replaced by normal people who fight for different ideologies, but regardless of the camp, they will pose the same danger. The heavy-hitting opponents are much more interesting on the other hand. There is no place for big daddies as we know them, so their role was taken by handymen, cyborgs originally created to help disabled people. Although, considering how hard this big guy hits, you could call him a machine that creates disabled people. The handyman has certain weaknesses like an open and unprotected head, but the safest way to kill him is to shoot his heart, which is hidden in a reservoir of fluid in its chest. This is no easy task though. The handyman is extremely agile for his weight and jumps like Hulk, covering long distances in a blink of an eye. The fireman looks no less powerful and intimidating, but he isn't here to put out the fire. On the contrary, he's here to set everything ablaze, like in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. This teapot on legs incinerates everything in a nearby radius, throws fireballs, and when he feels that death is near, he tries to blow himself up and take the protagonist with him. Quite a naughty guy. The twisted imagination of the Founders knows no bounds. Therefore, meet the Mechanical Patriot, a robot doll with the face of George Washington or Benjamin Franklin and a Gatling gun. The Patriots were created after the beginning of the Civil War, when the warring factions stole the dolls from museums and modified them to suit their needs. The Mechanical Washington is devoid of all human weaknesses, so he will fearlessly march head-on until he reaches his goal, like a Terminator. After killing this pile of metal, he can pick up its machine gun and use it as a heavy weapon. If all of the previously mentioned buggers are at least material and tangible, then the so-called Siren, alas, is not. Roughly speaking, it's a spirit trapped between the world of the living and the dead. It attacks with sound waves, resurrecting nearby corpses and simultaneously restoring a chunk of its health. Fighting this thing will be quite a challenge, as it frequently teleports and can take ethereal form. The best option would be to use heavy weapons against her, burning the corpses of her minions at the same time. We should also say a few words about the Songbird, who, along with Elizabeth and Columbia, has become a symbol of the third Bioshock. But the thing is, we don't really get to fight him. All the encounters with Elizabeth's winged guardian will happen in the form of scripted cutscenes. The similarities between the Songbird and the Big Daddy are visible to the naked eye and go beyond just the suit and appearance. They also have similar purposes. Both Frankensteins are attached to their girls, protecting them at the cost of their own lives. In Infinite, watching the relationship between Liz and the Songbird is extremely interesting and at times extremely heartbreaking. The entire gameplay has undergone some significant changes, despite the fact that it has not been fundamentally changed. Plasmids are still here, only now they are called Vigors. Personally, I was very pleased with this visual decision in terms of aesthetics. By the way, speaking of Vigors, a reasonable question would be, how did the Rapture technology end up in Columbia? It's all about the tears in space-time that can be found all over the city in the form of anomalies. While experimenting with them, entrepreneur Jeremiah Fink stumbled upon Yi Su-shang, a scientist from Rapture. While observing his experiments with Adam, Fink realized that by using an oxidizer, he could make the serums drinkable. So the role of local Eve, or mana, is played by the salts. The Songbird itself was developed by Fink in full cooperation with Su-shang, which is why this creature looks so much like Big Daddy. Anyway, back to the gameplay. Of course, there are lightning bolts that you shoot out of your hands, as well as manipulations with hypnosis and fireballs. But there were also some innovations, like a flock of ravens, a water stream, and a force field. But one detail changed everything: Elizabeth herself. She's the engine of the story, she's an intrinsic part of the gameplay, she's a partner, she's one of the most beautiful game characters of all time, and finally, she's a gem. The most important in Infinite at that. Elizabeth's appearance was given to her by a Russian model, Anna Moleva. The voice belongs to Courtney Draper.
Okay, you were right. I can't control it. It's not possible.
And the motion capture was done by a third actress. By the way, Booker DeWitt was voiced by Troy Goddamn Baker, aka Joel from The Last of Us. This is an enormous advantage to the game, because in the first two parts, we played as a completely silent protagonist, and judging by the diaries of the developers, they planned on doing the same to the new characters. Fortunately, the decision was changed, and Booker got an awesome mellow yet brutal voice.
Alright, looks like they expect me to sit in their fancy chair.
Elizabeth, in her turn, was probably the best companion in the history of video games. She is written flawlessly as a character. The girl, who has been locked up in a tower all her childhood and adolescence, will explore every corner of the city with childlike curiosity, thus inadvertently encouraging you as a player to do the same. But if you're not the kind of person who likes to turn every location upside down, looking for all the hidden goodies, don't fret. She will follow you regardless and will always find something useful for you, be it some ammo or a medkit. Her emotions, her monologues, and her behavior are out of this world. She's as pure and naive as a child, so the player develops an emotional connection with her. She's not an invertebrate armor bearer as in Fallout 4, where the NPC just reacts to your actions.
Oh, God.
Elizabeth is a self-sufficient with her own motivation, worries, desires, and fears. The developers did a tremendous amount of work creating her. What can I say? If a whole presentation was devoted to her alone? And it all paid off. With her, the gameplay seems completely different from that of the original game. There, the player was forced to wander around the city completely alone, occasionally breaking the silence by listening to audio diaries. We realized that no one would help us in Rapture, so we had to rely only on ourselves, digging through piles of garbage on our own, trying to find supplies. And now we have Elizabeth, who will both relieve our loneliness and toss an extra bullet. Thanks to the new partner's ability to open portals to parallel dimensions, the player can not only visit the same places in different variations, but also borrow items from there and use them to his own advantage, even mid-fight. Lacking firepower in a fight with a Patriot? Give Elizabeth a signal and she'll bring you a turret even from the underworld. And if your health gets depleted, it's once again Elizabeth who helps you get up. Isn't that the most touching thing you've ever seen? There's no point talking about how bafflingly well the writers integrate the tears into the narrative. You just have to play it, or watch a full playthrough on YouTube at the very least. Infinite gives you one of the best and most staggering storytelling experiences in the history of gaming. Ken Levine has kind of took Nolan's place here, except with video games. The amount of plot twists, narrative techniques, and visual variety is mind-blowing. The game's ending won't be giving you peace of mind for quite a while. While the Burial at Sea DLC, visually designed as a neo-noir, not only gives you a few more hours of exciting gameplay by letting you play as Elizabeth, but also masterfully connects the story of Rapture and Columbia. Sky-high sales, worldwide recognition. What went wrong if the game had such a stunning success, and why is this section of the video called the Death Of? As you already know, the development of Infinite was a pure production hell. The main reason to that was Levine's approach to creating his gaming masterpieces. Years later, in one of the interviews, he admits that he has always stuck this path. You spend years arsing around, and then it comes to you, there's no time left. Then you start making decisions in a hurry. And then, when you feel a gun barrel pushed against your head, the magic begins. Despite the resounding success, both Levine and his team felt completely drained. Months of sleepless nights, hundreds of hours of overtime, quadrillions of burned nerve cells, and tons of work done only to be scraped had the worst effect on the psyche of the employees. Some of them burned out completely and left the company, while those who stayed continued working on the DLC and would like to continue working on the series in the future. However, this was not going to happen because of one man, Ken Levine himself. He could no longer work with such a large staff and wanted to switch to a smaller and most importantly independent project, and therefore planned to leave the company. Levine wasn't just the face of Irrational Games, his power there was absolute and gathered the team of professionals around him. The management of 2K didn't envision the existence of Irrational Games without Ken, so after he left, the studio was closed. Closed after it had made one of the best games in the history of game dev. Yes folks, that's what happens when too much depends on one person. The shutdown of Irrational Games literally killed the franchise, leaving it no chance for a continuation or a reboot. In fact, because of the inept management, both Levine and 2K's short-sighted bosses, Bioshock reached the peak of its popularity and died. Years later, Levine will open up in another interview and confess that Infinite didn't meet his expectations and will generally describe the game as one big disappointment. He will also ask the gaming community not to make explicit content with Elizabeth, cause she's like a daughter to him. But Rule 34 is like the fourth law of thermodynamics. It cannot be defied. And oh my giddy aunt, does the internet have tons of unholy stuff laying in store. We truly live in a society. Guys, I think I installed the wrong Bioshock, but actually hey, wait a minute. Okay, jokes aside, the video is about the game, so hands on the table where I can see them. There will be more information about the long-suffering Bioshock screen adaptation. Take-Two signed a contract with Universal and the movie was supposed to be released back in 2010. Gore Verbinski, best known by directing Pirates of the Caribbean and Rango, was supposed to be responsible for it. The director had a big budget, R-rated film in mind, which implied tons of blood and gore. Pun not intended. But after the commercial flop of Watchmen, the studio backed out and the project was frozen. In 2015, Sony Pictures registered the Bioshock domain, and you'll never believe who wanted to play the lead role in it. But later, it was revealed that the adaptation was entrusted to Netflix and it will be a feature-length movie. So this is the thorny and tragic way the Bioshock series has come to an end, adored by millions of fans. To this day, there are rumors about a possible sequel, but Ken Levine will obviously have nothing to do with it. To be more precise, the continuation has long since been officially confirmed by 2K, but there are only rumors regarding its setting and other details. Thus, for example, the game is a code named Parkside, and its actions will take place in 1960 in the fictional town Borealis, Antarctica. The plot is somehow connected to the previous parts of the series. The development will be entrusted to a very young studio called Cloud Chamber, who got total creative freedom. The development team, however, includes veterans who have previously worked on the series: Scott Sinclair, art director of Infinite, and Hogarth de la Plante, level designer of the original game. Chances are that the game will be written on Unreal Engine 5, and the release was supposedly scheduled for 2022, but as we can see, it's now 2023, and all we have is rumors. As for Ken Levine, he founded a small studio called Ghost Story Games and has been working on a sci-fi shooter with an immersive sim component for 6 years now. Wish Levine good luck with a new game, Bioshock to have a worthy sequel, and to you, we wish all the best and thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Remember to tune in next time.